My name is Eli Locardi, and for the past 7 years, I've been traveling the world full-time, photographing the most beautiful landscapes and cityscapes on the planet. In 2014, I teamed up with F-Stoppers to produce Photographing the World, an in-depth video tutorial series where I teach my entire photography workflow both in the field and in post-processing. In Photographing the World 1, we traveled to Iceland and New Zealand, where I began with the basics and focused on capturing and creating world-class landscape photography. In Photographing the World 2, we traveled from New Zealand to Singapore, Cambodia, and Hong Kong to ramp up the complexity and introduce cityscape, astrophotography, and advanced post-processing. Now, with Photographing the World 3, it's time to travel to new destinations and ramp up the challenge by introducing more advanced techniques. From the start, we'll be focusing on shooting and editing portfolio-level work, all the while working with Adobe Photoshop and Lightroom while never relying on any third-party plugins. If you've already been following along with the series, or if this is your first time joining us, welcome to Photographing the World. Now, it's time to kick things off in one of my favorite locations in the world, the Amalfi Coast in southern Italy.
The roads into this place are a little treacherous to drive. You might argue that the lane is only big enough for one car, but somehow two buses can pass each other without any incidents. So it is a little bit tricky to get to, but well worth the effort. So just sit back, relax, and welcome back to Italy, guys. I'm really excited to show you guys some new spots and some new techniques. Welcome to Pasitano, everybody. This is easily one of the most popular towns in the Amalfi Coast, and in the summertime, it is a beach-goer's paradise. Here in the wintertime, it's a photographer's paradise because it may be a little cold outside, but we also have this place almost to ourselves. This is an exceptional beach town, but it's also carved into a cliff. These houses go all the way up to the top of the mountain. Everything is linked by old stone stairs. It's absolutely spectacular from the bottom and the top, and we're going to try to explore different levels so we can get different and unique compositions. It's been about 5 years since I've been here, and I'm excited to get back, and I think this is going to be a great reintroduction to my photography and post-processing techniques. Here we are, all set up. This is the first shot that I want to show you guys because it's a really beautiful view. It's also a really simple view, so it's a great way for us to dive right back into some core techniques I use to capture images like this. If you were to drive into Pasitano along the coast, you'd see this as you're driving into the town, and you probably want to stop and take a picture. Now, saying that, we are right next to the road. This is a little guardrail. It's a very public area, so you may hear cars and people walking by, but there's no problem. They're used to photographers. This is a great place to shoot. And again, it's really easy to find. But just because it's easy to find doesn't mean you shouldn't shoot it. And because it's easy to find, we're also seeing that it is a beautiful view. So sometimes these views that are easy to find become the more iconic, the very, poster-like shots for these locations. But personally, I think it's one of the best in the city. And again, it's a great way to start. A big part of what we're going to focus on for this entire tutorial is how I actually find the locations I decide to shoot. Sometimes that's going to require some hiking, some walking, and some cleverness to figure out which location is actually the best vantage point. For something like this, though, it literally is on the side of the road, so it's a great place for us to start. If you were to do a Google search on Pasitano or the Amalfi Coast, chances are this is going to be one of the shots that you're going to see on the first page of results. Secondly, it's something you're probably going to see multiple examples of the same shot. Now, you'll know that it's a really popular and easy to find location based on the amount of shots you see from that location. So if you see this specific spot coming up on a lot of pages, on a lot of results, then you know it's probably easy to find because a lot of people have been able to take the shot. What you don't know, though, is sometimes trees have gotten in the way, or they've built new buildings, or things are under scaffolding. So there may always be variations in what you find when you're on location. But based on your research, you should be able to get a good idea that, yeah, if I see a bunch of photos on Google in the same spot with slight variations from left to right, then this is a really easy location to find. Since this is a brand new tutorial that we're working on, and this is the first shot, a lot of things have changed since the last one, so I want to talk about my setup a little bit. First thing is, I've gone a lot lighter than before. So if you guys remember, I was using multiple cameras before. I was using a Nikon DA10, I was using a Fujifilm X-T1. But now, since the Fujifilm X-T2, Fujifilm X Pro 2, 24 megapixel APS-C camera, amazing photos, since I've changed the cameras and gone to a compact mirrorless format, I also changed the tripod. So I don't know if you guys remember that big bulky tripod by Really Right Stuff that I was carrying around. Now I have a couple really lightweight, ultra portable solutions. So both these tripods together don't really take up much weight. I can carry them easily and set them up. Now the other thing here is what I've done is I have a main angle, which I'm going to explain in a few minutes, and I have a B angle, just in case I want a different shot. But what I've done is I've set one up on the tripod, and to save space, I've actually put this other camera, the X Pro 2, on a little tabletop TFA Ultra tripod. Now, a good example today is there's nobody around. We're in the dead of winter, super off-season around here. But if I've already told you guys that this is going to be one of the most popular shots here, then chances are during season, if you guys are here during the summertime when everybody's visiting, there's going to be a lot of people around. So the last thing you want to do is have two massive tripods set up in the best location that everybody wants to take a selfie or get their own portfolio for themselves. So what I've done is I've taken this small tripod already and I've pushed it to the side. So if people have to walk by here, and that's somebody's house over there, if people have to walk by there, they're not going to kick it, they're not going to get mad at me, I'm not going to get mad at them. And for the second angle, I've just put this little camera here. Reason being, somebody could comfortably get in here, take a selfie, somebody could comfortably get in here and also take a shot, and I'm limiting the amount of space that I'm taking up and preventing the possibility of anybody accidentally kicking or knocking over my tripod. Now that we've established how easy and awesome this place is to find, let's talk about the cameras themselves. Now, true to what we've done before, I want to create a blended shot. Now, to review a little bit, what does that mean? It means that I may want to use part of a sunset sky with a blue hour foreground. That means I'm going to be shooting entirely through the sunset and the blue hour, and then in post, I'm going to figure out the best frames to blend together. So right now, it's about 4:15, I believe. Sunset is an early 5 o'clock here in the wintertime. It's a little cool out, but that really has nothing to do with our shooting condition. So what I want to do is frame my composition, get it ready so that when that sun starts to set, I'm in the correct position. Now that we've talked about the setup, the two cameras I'm using, let's look at the actual compositions. Remember, I can't move these cameras, so if I want to try two different compositions, I have to shoot with two different cameras. I'm pretty confident that the result I want is a wide angle. And the reason I want to use a wide angle is because the sky looks really nice. So if this blend works, if everything works out, I get a great sky, a great foreground, then I'm really going to want to highlight that beautiful sky with that foreground. So if we get lucky, that all comes into play. But what if the sky just duds out? What if it doesn't have any color? What if it's really flat and boring? Then I may not want a wide angle shot, because the wide-angle shot includes a bunch of the sky and a bunch of the water, which can be considered dead space. Knowing that I can't change my angle if things change, what I've done is I've set up the second camera zoomed a little bit more in, not making the focus part of the sky and part of the water, but instead making the focus the town itself. So if my wide-angle blend idea doesn't work out, I don't have to crop down my 24 megapixels into something smaller. I already have a version that's zoomed in that focuses specifically on the town. Now again, if I was just shooting shots and I wasn't worried about blending, I'd be able to do this with one camera because I could just change focal length. But since I'm doing all the blending, these two cameras are going to take care of both possible outcomes. Now let's take a look at the view from camera one. Now this is the result that I settled on. I like it, has a good balance of the sky, offsets the city a little bit to the right, and I like the way that the lines of the clouds come into the frame from the top left, into the town, and the lines from the surf and the water also mirror that and bring the eye back into the town. Now, the reason I settled on this specific focal length, while it is wide, I do have some things that are in my way if I wanted to go wider. Mainly, those things are the trees, which you can already see on the right, which I don't think is a deal breaker. I might be able to paint those out or just leave them in as compositional elements. But the main obstruction that I have to the scene we're going any wider is the house below. So take a look at this image. Since that big building's in the way, obviously that's a deal breaker. I don't want to spend my time trying to clone that out. Plus, I don't think that extending the beach and extending the water would do anything compositionally anyway. Let's take a look at camera B, or the second more zoomed in composition. Now, all I've really done is taken what I framed in camera 1 and I pushed in a little bit more. So I've still respected the top of the mountain. I still have some of these trees in the foreground. Now, obviously that church is still the most important element, I think, with the town. But I'm still including a little bit of the water, a little bit of the sky, and the beach. But if you looked at this, you really tell that I'm just trying to highlight the town itself. So we got a more zoomed in version, we got the wide angle version. Compositions are all locked in, camera 1, camera 2. Now let's talk a little bit about the settings. So the first thing I do in these kind of environments, in any landscape environment for that matter, is set my ISO to the lowest setting possible. These Fujifilm cameras have the lowest native setting of 200. So in this case, I keep it at 200. Your camera might go to 100 or even down to 50. Whatever the lowest setting is, go ahead and set your camera to that. That will give you a very clean result. Later in this tutorial, you never know, we may be shooting in really dark environments where we need to change that ISO setting, but if it doesn't matter, if you're shooting static objects and the changing light isn't a big deal and you can do longer exposures, leave it as low as possible for the cleanest result. F-stop is another one of those settings that I need to basically set it and forget it, especially with this type of blending. So I'm just going to pick the easiest, best aperture for this type of photography, which is f8. So both cameras are going to stay at f8 the entire time. That leaves us with one more setting, and that's just shutter speed. But since I'm using aperture priority, I'm locking in that aperture, the camera meter is automatically going to select the correct shutter speed as the light starts to progress. So right now, during the end of sunset here, it's relatively fast shutter speed, but once I get into the nighttime and the blue hour, that shutter speed is going to extend. The shutter is going to drag. Since it's in aperture priority mode, I don't have to do any of that work. I can just hit the button and the meter will determine how long the shutter should stay open. Now let's talk a little bit about auto exposure bracketing. I have this enabled on both cameras, and what I'm going to do is shoot 3 bracketed exposures. What I've also done, I've gone a little bit outside of the normal. Instead of doing this at 1 stop, I decided to do it at 1 1/3 stop. The reason being is when the light was looking really good in the sky, it was quite intense. So I started out with the median being a -1, so it would have shot a -1, a 0, and then a -2. But when I checked my histogram at -2, I felt like I still needed 1/3 stop to capture the highlights. Now, could I have captured those highlights or created them in post by bringing the slider back and getting them back? Probably, but maybe not. So I always want to make sure that my highlights are fully intact. So in this case, a little bit different, 1 stop, 1 1/3 stop. Not that big of a deal, and 3 bracketed exposures. One final thing I want to talk about here. I'm shooting with 2 cameras, and they're staying in the same position. I'm not changing any settings. Aperture priority takes care of that. Shutter speed is calculated automatically. So I'm going to take it a step further. Rather than having to press these shutter buttons every so often, every minute or every 2 minutes, I'm going to use my interval timer shooting instead. Essentially, what interval timer shooting allows you to do is using all of the camera settings that you've set on the camera. Interval timer shooting allows you to automate the shooting of your camera over time. In this case, I've told the camera to shoot every 60 seconds or every minute. So every minute, it's going to take 3 bracketed exposures. It's going to wait another minute, and then it's going to take 3 more bracketed exposures. Now, this is great already because it means that I can just relax here. I don't have to press the button. I don't even really have to pay attention to the scene. Or, in my case, I just want to kind of enjoy this beautiful environment I'm in. What's great about interval timer shooting is in most cameras these days, it's automatically built in. So I just had to go down in the menu, a few little items, and set it up. Completely internal inside of the camera. In the past, what we had to do was use an actual external remote or trigger release cable, and we'd have to set the interval inside of that. So this removes that accessory. We don't need it anymore, and it makes it easy because we can just set our cameras up, make sure everything's ready to go, flip the switch, and it does all the shooting for us. So here we are, blue hour starting to kick in. You can see that the sun actually set behind the mountain there, which is why I still have a lot of light in the sky. But even though there's still a lot of light in the sky, I'm starting to get those beautiful lights in the city. So the main lights, all of the street lights have turned on, some of the little street lights on the beach are on, and now I'm starting to get that illumination in the town itself. So we can see all of the big lights. Those street lights, they're on a timer, but what I'm really waiting for is for the subtle lights to come on. Those lights that illuminate the facade of some of these buildings. Those lights that come from inside of the windows that then create the window lights. So we're going to have to wait a little bit longer and see how many people are home, how many lights are going to come on, and take it from there. We're here right now in the middle of January. It is definitely the peak of the off-season compared to when people usually visit this location. The main benefit is that there are far fewer people here visiting. So I've been here now for about 2 hours, all of us together, and I'm the only one who's been here taking photos. This is a really small shooting spot, so I can imagine during the high season it could get really busy up here. But I've been looking down at the beach. During the season, I'm sure there's a bunch of chairs out, people are sunbathing, and a lot of people are down there enjoying the beautiful southern Italian sunshine. But it's like 38 degrees right now, so there's nobody down there sunbathing, and everybody's bundled up. So we kind of have the place to ourselves, and that is a huge advantage. Now, the disadvantage of shooting in the off-season is right now I'm looking at the lights coming on, but I don't know how many people are home. Most people have left here. The people who live here have left for the winter, and people aren't visiting as much as they usually do. So the town itself is kind of a ghost town. So it makes it really fun to shoot, really fun to explore, but I'm not sure until it's full dark out how many windows are going to come on, how many hotels are open, and how many lights are going to be turned on during this low season. So I really have to shoot through and wait for all those lights, wait to full dark past the typical blue hour to see how many of those lights come on and if I can use them in my composition. With blending in general, and this scene specifically, what I'm really hoping for is to be able to use the best parts of each duration of time. So I really like the way the sky looks. I'm hoping that sky pulls out a lot of color, and I really like the way the water looked when it got a little darker. And about now, I really like the way that the mountain looks. It's not quite full dark, but it's rapidly approaching full dark. The only reason you guys can see me so well right now is because we have a full-size panel light right here, which kind of just blinded me when I looked at it. And we also have a storefront that actually has a lot of lighting. So I'm fully illuminated. But in another few minutes, that sky is going to turn dark. That mountain's going to be completely black. And what I'm hoping, though, is that the lights from within the city start to illuminate. So this could turn into a multi-time blended shot. So I could be using some of the sunset, some of the blue hour, and some of the full dark. Right now, this is actually a pretty good late blue hour scene. Sunset behind there, so I still have a nice bit of ambient light in the sky, but it's not quite dark enough yet for the lights to come on all the way. And what I'm worried about if I was doing this in a single shot is if I wait till full dark, the city might look spectacular, but everything else is black. The sky's black, barely any light, we can't see any details in the mountains, the beach is gone, completely obscured, and the trees, you can't even tell are trees. It's always interesting to me shooting in this style because I look at the scene and I'm like, wow, that was a great sky, that was a great blue hour, and the city looks amazing. But until I can actually look at these frames on a big screen and start blending them together, I'm not sure if I'm going to use a single exposure, 2 blended frames into a blended moments in time, or 3, or maybe elements. Maybe I use parts of the sky, parts of the mountains and trees, and then I bring a later scene back to illuminate the city. What I always want to make sure is that I cover all my bases, and that means shooting everything I think I might need, just in case I do need it later. All things considered, this was a pretty nice scene. I think with some post-processing and some blending, it'll look pretty good. I think the sky was okay. If I had a second attempt, I'd hope for some more color in the sky. And I anticipate there's going to be some issues and some discrepancy trying to figure out how much illumination should be on the mountain from the sunset, and then how many lights should be on in the town itself. So there's always that danger when you're blending too much time together or too long of a span of time that you break reality. So obviously you wouldn't have the ball of the sun right in the shot illuminating the mountain and then a fully dark interior scene at nighttime. People would register, you cannot see street lights when the sun is out. So I'm going to have to pick and choose wisely. And right now, I think I'm going to be able to put it all together, but we're never going to know until we bring it into post. At this point, I think I've shot as long as possible. There's still a little bit of light in the background in the sky, but I think all of the city lights have come on. And I'm also having a couple problems too. The main, very intense street lights down there are going to start washing out these surrounding areas. So the later I wait, the more intense those big lights are going to get, and the more those big lights are going to wash out the other lighting around them. So right now seems to be that perfect time where I think all the lights are on and the city looks at its best. It's a little later now, it's a little darker, and I think I've taken the final shot. The reason I know it's the final shot is the longer I wait now, even just a few minutes, and the scene doesn't get any better. I can see the lights getting brighter, but as the lights get brighter, I can't see any of the buildings, just the lights. So it's basically just these hot little lights and darkness around it. That's a good indication that it's time to pack it up. I've shot everything that I think I need, and we had a pretty good sky. I think I have all the elements I need. Now we just need to take them into post and blend them back together. Welcome back to the post-processing studio, everybody. I'm really excited to kick off lesson 1 of Photographing the World 3 today. Now, it's interesting that today is also my birthday. So to answer your first question, yes, there's of course going to be cake later, but that brings up an interesting point. 2 years ago, to the day, we released Photographing the World 1 landscape photography and post-processing, and we followed up 6 months later with Photographing the World 2, which went into cityscapes, astrophotography, and advanced post-processing. Now with Photographing the World 1, I was able to start fresh. If you didn't know how to use Lightroom or Photoshop, I walked you through step by step from the beginning all the way through intermediate. Photographing the World 2 picked up where number 1 went off and started to introduce very advanced techniques like luminosity masking and time blending and astrophotography. So this is Photographing the World 3. This is an advanced course that actually picks up right where number 2 leaves off, and this one is geared towards creating portfolio level work. In other words, we've already spent a lot of time together learning all of these tools and techniques in Photographing the World 1 and 2. Now it's time to apply everything we know and learn a few more tools and techniques to create beautiful portfolio level work. I just want to quickly mention that even if you're new to Photographing the World and you have some basic understanding of Photoshop and Lightroom, this should work perfectly for you. If it does seem a bit confusing at first, just take it slow because each lesson I'll introduce new techniques and each lesson will get progressively more difficult from start to finish. So this will build up as an actual lesson structure. This is very similar to the way Photographing the World 1 and 2 worked as well. If you've already completed Photographing the World 1 and 2, then the flow of Photographing the World 3 is going to feel very similar. It's going to build up in complexity as we go, and we're also in for a special treat. This time, we're going to break our reliance on third-party plugins and try to produce every single thing we do manually using a combination of just Photoshop and Lightroom. Now, bear in mind that most of these lessons have 2 portions. They will have an in-the-field component and a post-processing component. So if you're not entirely comfortable with post-processing, I just want to tell you guys, don't panic. I'm going to make it as simple as possible and break it down step by step. Now, my process is not that complicated, though we do use complex tools now and again to solve some of the problems we find in the individual scenes. Now, it'll basically start with raw processing, and then there will be any exposure blending or time blending that needs to be done. After that, we'll focus on adding dynamic contrast, saturation, and vibrance to give richness back to the image. After that, we'll be following up with selective sharpening and noise reduction. So it's going to be really easy. Just feel free to sit back, relax, and follow along as I break down each scene step by step, start to finish. Just a few quick things I want to cover before I talk about the lesson structure itself, and one is the hotkeys. Now, I am using an Apple computer, which means my hotkeys are going to be Command and Option. So something like copy, for example, for me on a Mac is Command C. On a PC, it'll be Control C. So anytime you hear me say Command, if you're on a PC, use Control. Anytime you hear me say Option and you're on a PC, use Alt. It's pretty easy to just swap those hotkeys. Another thing I want to point out is I am using a Wacom Intuos Pro with the stylus. This is a medium tablet. Now, it has the main pressure sensitivity on the tip here. It has an eraser, which I never use. And it also has two buttons. Now, any of these buttons you can actually bind to some custom sets of controls in the options themselves. I just want to bring that up really quick and show you what I'm using. So here, I've added Photoshop as an individual application for this stylus. So all other, you can see that this button down here is pan and scroll. This one's right click. But in Photoshop, this becomes a modifier of control and option. Now, I use this because when I actually use this button in Photoshop and drag from left to right, I can change the brush size. Up and down, I can change the hardness of the brush. So you're going to be seeing me doing that a lot in Photoshop, and this is exactly how I have it bound to these keys. Now, I'm using a medium tablet. This is a 24-inch monitor. I usually work on 24 or 27-inch monitors with a medium tablet. On the road, I use a MacBook Pro, which is a 15-inch monitor, and in that case, I actually use a small Wacom. So if you're new to the Wacom, it just takes a little bit of time to get used to, but trust me, you're going to love it much more than using a mouse. When you download these lessons, each lesson will come with a set of companion files. And if you look here on the screen, it's going to look something like this, though this is just showing the Italy files. But here on lesson 1, if I expand it, you're going to see a Lightroom catalog where you can quickly access the same files that I'm working on. All of the raw files and input are here in this folder, everything that you need to recreate the scenes that we're working on. And as reference, I have also saved the final PSD file with every change that we've done on screen, all named so you can quickly reference every tool and technique we used. The reason I've done this is I wanted to give you the ultimate flexibility to either follow along and watch me or work alongside at your own pace. That way you'll have everything that you need to rebuild these from start to finish with or without the video tutorials themselves. Really quickly, if you run into an issue, if you open the Lightroom catalog and for some reason it's showing a little question mark, now right now all of these files are intact, if it is showing a little question mark, it may just be because you've moved that folder. And if you have moved that folder and it can't find the raw files or the input associated with each individual lesson, just select it right here, raw files and input, right click, and select Update Folder Location. Point that to the necessary lesson folder and everything will come in and be ready to go. A very important point I want to make before we get started. Each lesson, we're including the original raw files necessary to recreate each of these lessons from start to finish. Now, bear in mind, we are providing these raw files for education purposes only. We actually own the copyright to all these images, so please, I'm asking you guys, do not promote these images as your own. Don't post them to Facebook or Instagram or hang a gallery in New York City. We really want to discourage that, and frankly, we'll probably find out about it, and when we do, it will be, let's just say, a little awkward. So please, just use these to learn all of these skills for education purposes only. Consider that the end of the introduction to the Photographing the World 3 post-processing studio. With that, I want to dive right into this Lightroom catalog and take a look at the Pasitano sunset that we shot together in the field. But first, let me just point out one more thing. If we take a look on screen, you're going to see every single raw file that I captured in the field, both on the X-T2 and the X Pro 2. Now, the reason being, a lot of Photographing the World 3 is actually about scouting, and after scouting, finding the right location. And then when we're in the right location, it's shooting so many different bracketed exposures and then selecting the right ones for blending. Now, blending could be multiple exposures of the same time. In other words, 3 clicks to expose for the shadows and the highlights. Or it could be, like this scene we're going to work on now, more of a time blend where we need to find the best version of the sunset to go with the best version of the blue hour. Now, in the field, you're going to see me using the interval timer mode, and I'm going to be shooting every 1 to 2 minutes. Now, that means a massive amount of raw files. So the lesson files are only going to include the files that you need to create the final output that we're going to work on together. But for a few of these lessons, especially the first few lessons, we're going to be taking a look at my actual Lightroom catalog first and going through the culling process and the selection process of how I determine the best sunset, the best blue hour, and the images that I'm going to use in the final PSD.
Remember, I was using the Fujifilm X-T2 and the X Pro 2, so let's go ahead and take a look at the X Pro 2. And the first thing that I want to cover, and I was using interval timer mode, was the bracketing order. Now, the bracketing order is actually going to be the median or neutral exposure, followed by the +1 or the overexposure, followed by the underexposure. So median exposure, overexposure, and underexposure. So that's going to be the bracketing order for this camera. Now I'm pretty sure in the Fujifilm settings I could have changed that to be -1, 0, and +1, and in some cameras you're able to change that, some cameras you're not. Some cameras you're locked to this format. And I just wanted to point out that throughout this tutorial we're going to be looking at it as a median, +1, and -1 as we go through that. And if you're not sure, if you're in a situation where you're not sure how your camera is actually bracketing, if you go to the library panel and you're shooting in interval timer mode, you'll see that this one starts at 755.59. So it's just going to go through these and it's going to stay 755. But the next one should jump to 756. So I know that this was a bracketing order right here, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So I could quickly determine that it's going to be median, over, and under. Let's take a look at some common settings for Fujifilm before we begin editing this file. Now remember, Photographing the World 1, we were using Lightroom and Photoshop. Photographing the World 2, we were using Capture One and Photoshop together. The reason I did that, it wasn't because I prefer Capture One over Lightroom. It was that I wanted to teach you guys two different ways to process RAW files. Now since that time, Lightroom has gotten much better at post-processing the RAW files for Fujifilm, and I've since been working more and more with Lightroom alone. And using the Fujifilm files, I just want to point out a few things. Now, Fujifilm does a few things in camera, and the one thing that it does in camera that's very important is enabling the profile corrections. Notice that it says built-in lens profile has been applied. Well, that means if I click this button here, nothing is going to happen. It's already done in camera. If you're shooting with a Canon or a Nikon or any kind of full frame camera, I'm not sure about all Sonys, you have to check. A lot of the times you have to enable profile corrections and then your lens should pop up right here. But you're not really going to see me do that because we're going to be working specifically with Fujifilm files. The other thing here is the remove chromatic aberration. I've done some tests on the Fujifilm files. If this is checked or unchecked, it actually makes no difference. CA is removed in camera as well. We are going to be doing some transformations here. We're going to be using a lot of these different settings as we go on in the tutorials. But if you scroll down here, I want to show you something very, very important, and that's camera calibration. Let's pick an overexposed shot so we can really see this in action. The default is Adobe Standard, and that's what I'm really going to be focusing on because it is rather flat. And it's a way that we can then take that flatter image and bring it into the color correction that we want. It's sort of like sculpting our own color correction from a very bland start. And if you want to get something that was close to the camera, for example, like the JPEGs coming straight out of camera, the default on the Fujifilm is Provia, so you can actually change the color space back to something similar. Provia being sort of contrasty. Velvia is going to be the vivid mode, which is going to be very oversaturated. Astia is going to be sort of a soft, somewhere in between Provia. So you can get this to look exactly like the JPEGs that you're getting straight out of camera on the Fujifilm. I've done tests and they're almost identical, but we're going to go ahead and leave that in Adobe Standard. The other thing I want to point out here is something that they do by default inside of Lightroom. So inside of Lightroom, the detail, you get an automatic 25% sharpening. Now historically, I'd remove this, but now working with the Fujifilm files so much, I wanted to find a very powerful way to get the best result outside of Lightroom while these files are still in RAW format, meaning that we can get more out of them when they're in RAW than we can once we bring them into Photoshop. So I've actually determined that the sharpening 25 plus a noise reduction of about 20 seems to yield, universally with most scenes here, Fujifilm, the best results. And if I actually go into Photoshop, we can take a look at that really quick. Let's go ahead and zoom in here. Now I have 3 layers just as a quick test for you guys. Now I have sharpening 0, and if we point right in on these buildings here. Now I have sharpening 0 and noise reduction 0. I have sharpening 25. Let's turn that on. So by default, you can see that you get some nice sharpening from Lightroom. But with that sharpening, you also get a little bit of noise from that sharpening, which is natural. If you change the noise reduction to 20, it actually cleans that up. And if I zoom in here on the facade of the building, we have nice, soft texture that came right out of camera of a Fujifilm, and then we have the sharpening from Lightroom that brings it a little bit back, and then we have the noise reduction, a soft 20, that actually pulls that detail away. So you basically still get the sharp edges and you don't get as much noise in the image. So throughout this tutorial, we're going to be using those settings. Now, feel free to experiment with your own settings and see what you like the best. The important takeaway here is when we're doing blending, we want this to always be consistent. So for each one of these scenes, we just want to make sure that it works with all the files that we're going to be joining together. Now that I've explained the sharpening and noise reduction, let's head back into Lightroom. Now remember, this is everything that I shot from the X Pro 2 and the X-T2. First of all, let's take a look at the difference. Now remember, in the field, I really wasn't sure what the sunset was going to do, and just as a precaution, and what I usually do, is set up two unique compositions. This time, I had the X-T2. If we take a look here, I had it way zoomed out. And you can see here, way zoomed out, looks really cool right here. Sunset's pretty interesting, but I feel like there's a lot of blank space in the sky. But as that sunset starts to get a little bit more intense and vivid, now this is the underexposed version, you can see that those clouds roll through, and eventually they start to dissipate up here. So while this is interesting, I feel like showing the town down here in the lower right corner really isn't the most interesting thing that we can do, especially because now we have all this negative space up here. So it just doesn't really fill the scene. So with the X Pro 2, I decided to zoom in, and I'm glad I did, because similarly here, we have a really cool sky. We're more pushed into the city, and as I start to roll through here to some of the post-sunset shots here, the underexposed ones, you can see that at the time where most of this was going to go away on the top and become blue, this still looks really nice. In other words, we already have cloud detail in the sky. So automatically, I like this zoomed in version for two reasons. One, the sky. Two, the detail of the city. So if we look at this X-T2 version right here, if I were to say settle on this, or this was my only camera, I would have had to go up here to the develop settings and crop it. And if I were to crop it to a similar composition that I had with the other scene, you can see what happens there. In fact, it's even more like this. That's what my other scene looks like. Now that's a significant amount of resolution loss, and that's something that I want to avoid. So shooting two different compositions, one wide and one zoom, gives you the ability to select the one you're going to use and minimize any cropping and get the most out of the megapixels in your camera. So we've settled on the X Pro 2, which is going to be zoomed in quite a bit more. Well, now I've kind of made some markers here in green, but the idea is to find the best version of the sunset. Now, we're going to kind of kick things off with a bang here and do a fairly complicated time blend for our first lesson in Photographing the World 3. In order to do that, we need to first determine what sky plate we want to use, and then the blue hour, early and late, are much easier to determine than the sunset. It's interesting too that being out in the field, finding these compositions, researching this, finding the best vantage points, and shooting often is easier than actually selecting the images you want to work on. I'll find that while I'll spend days and weeks in the field, I may spend months sort of combing through these files and culling them and figuring out which one is the best. Now, the way that I do it is I actually select each one of them. Now here you can see that my underexposed file, it's definitely not the one that I'm going to be working on right off the bat, but you can see that all of the details of the sky are intact. Now we'll get into those settings in just a moment, but the way that I actually select these is I just command select each sunset, just like this. I will actually go forward through time and back through time, all the way through the point where I feel like the sunset starts to lose my interest. And I just scroll over and select. So you can see that by this time, I feel like the sunset has dissipated, and here you can see that it hasn't quite hit that peak of color that I want. So what I actually do is I select them all, and then with the arrow keys on the keyboard, I actually just audition these one by one
by one. And I roll through until I start to find the areas that I really, really like. And as you can see, I go a little bit further, and I'm liking that white cloud on the left, but I'm not liking this gray cloud. I feel like this is breaking up a little bit. So as I move further to the right, I'm starting to determine that, you know what, I feel like it's lost some of its intensity. So I go back, and I go back to the left. And I feel that right around here, it's starting to look good again. And right around here and here, it's really looking its best. Now, what's interesting, between here, here, and here, I really like this one as opposed to this one, and here's why. I love the way that this cloud right here, if I move just to the right, starts to come in and create this little bit of loop, sort of this little whip up to the corner. The other thing I like is if I go too far to the right, now this cloud, if I keep moving over while that cloud comes into frame, you can see that I'm starting to lose that white cloud on the right. So I kind of like something right around here or here. Now what I've done is I've actually marked the ones that I like the best as green. I like to use visual cues to show me which ones I like. Now I'll use green, and I just right click here and set the color label to green. If there were other ones that I was thinking of, I might want to go in and set those, for example, to color label yellow. Now, obviously you can use star ratings. You can star these 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or you can pick them with flags, whatever's easiest for you. I just know that when I zoom through something like this, I can easily find and quickly find, you'll see as I do this, the ones that I've selected for the blue hour because they'll pop up as colors. See how the green just popped up? Sometimes those stars are missing. So let's just say that's going to be the sunset. The next thing that I'm going to do while we're on the topic is find a nice early blue hour. So you can see as we start to get later and later and later, let's just go ahead and go to here, you can see that the lights are starting to turn on. But I don't think they've turned on quite too much yet. Let me go ahead and start right about here. Same thing, I'm going to select, and I'm just going with the overexposed ones this time because we're not going to use this as a base exposure. I'm going to be using it to determine the lights themselves. So let's go ahead and start from the beginning here. Now I have a mid blue hour, early blue hour getting into mid, and as I move over to the right, the lights are going to become more and more intense. Now a few things are going on here. One, as I move further in time to the right, the town becomes a little bit more lit, basically. And remember, when things are severely backlit, in other words, that sun's well behind the mountain, tends to wash out the foreground. So I really have to wait a while before that town starts to light up. But here's what happens. Once that town starts to light up, pay attention to this harsh light. This is by far the brightest light in the entire frame. So if I back it up a little bit more, you can see that that light decreases in intensity. That's exactly what I want. Now I want to use an earlier blue hour where that light isn't too intense. And as you can see, somewhere between here and here looks pretty good. Now between this one and the one that I have selected, you can see that a car drove through and gave me this nice streak of light through the town, where the one previously does not have that. If I go one later, you can see that that's also gone. So that's the whole reason that I chose this one. Now, a few minutes before, a few minutes after are going to be fine, but this one I felt was perfect and gave me some additional lights in the town. Next thing I wanted to do was find a late blue hour, and I'm going to show you the one that I selected here. Now, this is really interesting because this is the neutral exposure, and you can see that this light is intense, but it's so dark that my normal exposure at f8 is already 26 seconds. So the overexposed can't break 30 seconds, so it's going to pick 30 seconds. Now something really interesting happened between these two shots. Now check out this one and take a look at the church up top. Now check out this one and take a look at the church now. Well, the lights are not flickering on the church. That means that a car actually drove by and illuminated it. So thankfully I have that exposure. So if I roll back to my earlier blue hour, and we take a look at both of these together, you can see that here's my early blue hour, much less light. Here's my late blue hour, much more light. So those are going to be the basic selections. Those are the selections we're going to use to build our first lesson together. It's going to be combining the peak of a sunset with two versions of the blue hour. So we're going to do a 3-stage time blended shot.
Now that all the files are selected, let's go to the project folder, Lesson 1, Italy, Positano Sunset, and I'll open the Lightroom catalog associated with the lesson. Here we have everything that I selected, and I went ahead. Since this is the first lesson, I included all 3 exposure brackets for each scene. So you can see we have our sunset, we have our early blue hour, and we have our very late blue hour. The idea here is we want to go ahead and blend all 3 of these scenes into one seamless photograph. Most of the options that we are going to be using here are in the Develop module. And these settings are going to be found here between exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, blacks, occasionally later on some clarity, vibrance, and some saturation. There are going to be some selective things that we're going to use, but I want to point out just as a quick review for you guys, just in case it's been a while since you've opened Lightroom, these are really easy to use, but what I want to cover is the philosophy of raw processing in general. Now, raw files these days are incredible, and Fujifilm is leading the charge in dynamic range. Now, what is dynamic range? Well, dynamic range is the amount of light that we're capturing in these raw files, meaning that what we see is not necessarily what we get. What we see on the back of the LCD display on our cameras is not necessarily how far we can push these in post-processing. And by push, I mean sometimes recover or shift or redistribute the light in the scene. Now, with most raw files, you can always get more out of the shadows than you can in the highlights. Let me go ahead and show you an example. Let's say we took this overexposed shot, and you know what? This looks pretty good, though it's a little bit overexposed in the town. But the sky, we can all agree that the sky is completely blown out. Well, what would happen if I pulled the exposure down to try to compensate? But you can see that a lot is happening here. Some of the sky is coming back, but notice this area, these white spots, that's gone forever. Even if I pull the highlights down, that's gone. Even if I pull the whites down, that's gone. It's just gone. These areas of extreme highlight are impossible to recover. Let me go ahead and reset that. But if I go to the underexposed image, for example, and let's say that I change the exposure again this way, you can see that as I bring the town up, and let's just go ahead and go 2 full stops, I'm able to get the town back. And if I take a look at this overexposed image, you can see that the towns themselves look very similar, almost identical. Well, I can pull about 2 to 2.5 stops from the shadows with the Fujifilm raw files, and that's really nice. But I can't do the same in the highlights. But the cool thing is, let's take this for example. I just changed the exposure here to +2, I can still take the highlights back. So if I pull those highlights and whites back to compensate, I can actually get that sky back. While it looks a little bit flat and dull, you can see that I still get all of the detail back. So here's the sky from the original exposure, and here's the sky from the underexposed image, but you can see the town comes back. So keeping that in mind, what I like to do is, especially in the beginning of photographing the world here, I like to keep things simple. So we're going to try to solve this with a single raw. First thing I want to do is double check something. Now I know I can get all of my shadows from the underexposed image, but can I get my highlights back from the neutral exposure? Now while it seems okay here on the histogram, if I hit the J key on the keyboard, you can see that these red areas are going to show as clipped. Now even though those are the only areas that are showing as clipped, for example, if I go here to the overexposed file, do the same thing and hit J, you can see more is clipped. Visually, we can tell that they need some work. In other words, this is white, where this underexposed file here, you can see these nice pink tones in all of these details. It's just starting to heat up a little bit around the sky here because the sun is right behind the cloud. So here, I want to test to see if I can get that back. And if I go down a little bit, I can almost get it back. I just want to quickly toggle between these two. And you can see the underexposed. See how these details look a little bit more sort of creamy, and these details, I'm starting to lose some really sharp areas in the highlights. That leads me to believe, and I'm just going to go ahead and reset these, that I want to use the underexposed image. So just to prove the power of these raw files, let's go ahead and make our adjustments to the underexposed version of this sunset. The first thing I want to do though is address something that I spoke about previously, and that is the noise reduction. So remember, I want to use a noise reduction of 20 and a sharpness of 25. So I'm going to go ahead and set that, and now that it's set, I'm going to right-click under Develop Settings, Copy Settings, and I'm just going to make sure that it could be like this, everything could be checked, or nothing could be checked. And I just want to make sure that I check off noise reduction, copy that, and what I can actually do is select all of these, right-click, under Develop Settings, paste those settings. All right, now that that's applied, let's go ahead and get started with this. Now, something to keep in mind, I am going to start redistributing and balancing the light of this image, but I'm going to be putting lights over top of it. In other words, I'm taking a sunset and blending it with a nighttime shot. So I don't want to go too crazy and overexpose it, so I'm going to start pretty subtle. Let's just set the exposure up here, maybe to something about 1. And I'm also going to bring the shadows up a little bit. And I like to use fairly even numbers in photography, 1, 25, 50, things like that. So 1 stop, quarter stop, half stop. Now I could even go further to pull the highlights in the town up just a little bit, but I'm going to do that in a different step. So right here, I could pull the highlights down, and if I did that, I'd get the sky back. But see how the town itself is becoming more dull as I do that? I really don't want that to happen. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to create a gradient just for the sky. So up here, we're going to create a selective adjustment. And if you're new to this, you just click this here, and you can see it has some default settings. That's okay. And the first area I click will be 100% selected. And as I draw this down, you can see that it's going to be to 0. If I show the selected mask overlay, you can see how this works. And as I start to compress this, you can see it works just like a normal gradient. Well, I know I have highlights here and I have highlights here, so let's go ahead and move this exactly into the area that we want. We can go ahead and fade it out, just like that. We're going to hide this. By default, there was an exposure of 1. Let's make that 0. So let's go ahead and tweak the highlights. Now you have pretty much a representation of everything that you had, plus a few other things, defringe, sharpness, and dehaze, which is going to come in really handy in some future lessons. But let's go ahead and do the simple thing and pull these highlights back down. So we want to go ahead and get all of those values back that we lost. And I'm just going to change this again to -50, which is half the extent of the slider. Let's also pull the whites down. I'm taking a look at the histogram here, and you can see that if I highlight these and actually move it, you're going to see things change as well. So you can do that for the global scene. And this is basically just blacks, and you can see that light up right underneath my cursor, shadows, exposure, highlights, and white. So basically, as a review, if you're not sure which part of the histogram these correlate with, you can just roll over and see it right there. So we're going to go ahead and change the highlights. Let's adjust the whites just a little bit. That looks pretty good, actually. We'll just say -25. So to go back to global settings, just click this again to disable it. Now you can see we're back in our global settings. Let me hit the J key. And you can see that the highlights in the sky are looking great, but I have some shadow problems here. I've already raised the shadows up a little bit, and I don't think I want to raise the shadows up overall in the scene too much more. So what I'm going to do is use another gradient. So this was the one I previously created. Now I'm going to create one from here to about here. And we're going to zero this out. That 1 in the exposure is just there to show you that you have something selected. And again, you can always show it here as well. Now I can actually just bring the shadows up just a tiny little bit on the bottom, just to remove that so it's not completely black. Really, really easy. We go back to our global settings. This is looking pretty good as a base exposure. So the next thing I want to do is bring the base plate into Photoshop, and I'm going to do that this way. I'm going to right click and export. And on my desktop, I actually have a folder called temp or temporary. Now that folder just holds all of these files that I export, and I'll explain why in just a minute. Now my settings are PSD, Pro Photo RGB, 16 bits. So make sure you're always working at 16 bits. The camera shooting, Adobe RGB, I'm working in Pro Photo, which is the highest color gamut, so I know that my output, if I add any colors, will be in this color space. Resolution, I use 300 DPI. I export with all the metadata, and I like to open it in Photoshop in the end. So I'm going to go ahead and export this right now. Now that this is in Photoshop, let me go ahead and close this example that sharpening example. Let's go back to Lightroom really quick, and I just want to show you one thing. I use the export. Now, you can always do something like edit in. Just bear in mind that if you use the edit in command, it's going to, yes, bring it into Photoshop, but then it's going to take that PSD and also bring it back here into Lightroom. I do not want that PSD inside of Lightroom. I simply just want to export different versions, combine them together in Photoshop, and then maybe later, once that PSD is finalized and done, I might then bring it back into Lightroom or into a different Lightroom catalog. Now it's time to move on and work on our early blue hour shot. So I'm going to turn off the J key, so it's going to stop that clipping. That's actually not important. Now this is the neutral exposure, so what I'm actually going to do here is pull the highlights down just a little bit, and I'm actually going to pull the shadows up just a little bit as well. And now by pulling up the shadows here, I can just, let's use an even number. Let's use 25 and negative 50. So a half a stop here in the shadows. Whoops, sorry. I did that wrong. Let's actually do negative 25, and we'll do 50 here. And you can see what this is going to do is it's just going to bring up a little bit of the ambient light around those surrounding highlights. And that's the only thing that I'm actually going to do right now, and I'm going to export again. Now, since my settings are already set in the export panel, I can say export with previous. Back in Photoshop now, I want you to remember this set of hotkeys. We're going to be using this all the time to bring one PSD into another. Obviously, there are quite a few different ways to do this, but I'm going to select everything, which is Command A for select all, Control A on a PC, Command C for copy. Everybody knows the copy hotkey, and Command W is close because I don't need this anymore, and I'm going to paste it right on top. So now I have my adjusted sunset and adjusted early blue hour. I'm just going to save this in the background while I explain this. Now, throughout these tutorials, I'm going to be naming every single layer while you guys follow along. Now, the reason is when you open up the PSD associated with each lesson, it's going to be the same file that we created here together. So later on, after you watch the lesson, if you want to quickly refresh yourself on everything that we've done, everything will be layered, named, and organized. So here we have 1 and 2. It's like being at the eye doctor. Better or worse? Better or worse? Neither one is better or worse. It's actually two completely different scenes. We have a sunset and a blue hour. You know, obviously we could do some incredibly difficult masking, or we can just use one of my favorite blending modes. And let's go ahead and do that since this is the first lesson. Instead of normal, we're going to use the lighten blending mode. Well, when this happens, a few things occur. Now, 1, those lights are actually popping into the town. 2, there's some problems in the sky, but we'll address that here shortly. The first thing is, let's take a look at the town. Now again, I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm going to show you that if I turn this back to normal, you can see that those lights look almost identical, but if I change it to lighten, you can see that those lights basically just sit right on top of the background. So that's nice. So lighten actually takes everything that's above a percentage of gray and it puts it right on top. So it's a way that we can do stuff like add the lights for a blue hour shot to a sunset or a backplate of a different moment in time. Later on, it's going to come in really handy when we're going to stack a bunch of stars together to create star trails. This is a very important blending mode for this type of post-processing, especially blending moments in time. So what we can do here is we can say, you know what, I really like what's happening here, but I really don't like what's happening here. So what are we going to do? We're going to create a mask. Now, if you've never created a mask before, it might be a good idea to brush up on some basic Photoshop skills, but I'm going to go ahead and explain it anyway. When you create a mask with a layer selected, it applies a mask to that layer. Now, in masking, whatever is white is fully opaque or visible. Whatever is black is invisible. So since this is fully black, everything's painted out. Now that it's white, everything's painted in. So if I look at this, I can actually, with the paintbrush tool, brush. Now remember when I was talking about that hotkey associated with my stylus here, with the brush tool selected, if I click and drag left and right, I can change the size and the hardness. Now, this is pressure sensitive. So if I change my palette to paint black,
and I have a flow of, let's say, 10%, you can see I can start to slowly brush in this opacity. See how that layers it? It's really nice. But what if I did something different, and what if I had the opacity set to 10%? Or let's just average right around 18%. Well, flow is pressure sensitivity. Opacity is opacity. So no matter how much I press on this pen, it's never going to go above 18% until I lift up and click again. So this is like click, click, click with the mouse as opposed to pressure sensitivity. So what I actually do use, very, very rarely will I change the opacity, and I just use the flow. With this checked, is the airbrush pressure sensitivity is turned on. And if I use the keys, the number pad, 1 for 10, 2 for 20, 3 for 30, and I can even split the difference and say 2.5 for 25. So I can use, let's say, a 40% flow, and I can brush in all the way to black, or I can be very soft, and I can do some paintbrush or airbrush style effects. And that's exactly what I want to do here. So I'm going to go back to the layer itself, select the mask with black here on the palette, and bear in mind that if I hit the X key on the keyboard, I can swap back and forth between black and white or foreground current, foreground and background color. But I'm going to go ahead and paint out this sky here. So let's just go ahead. We know we don't want any of that sky. We want to keep the sky, and we also want to keep that water, just like that. We're going to keep a lot of the beach. So I'm just going to go ahead and paint that in at 100%. Let's go ahead and zoom in. And right around here, I'm going to go back to the brush, make a smaller brush, and I'm going to change the flow to 20%, and I'm just going to softly brush in this area around the water because we need it. We don't need it. And even those lights there, we'll just go ahead and get rid of those. So let's just go ahead and brush this in. Let's get all of our water back, just like that. If I zoom out, now you can see the mask right here. If I option click the mask, it'll show it. And you can see that I missed some of the sky. If I use the backslash key, it'll put it into Ruby Lift mode, and it will show an overlay of the areas, and you can see that I have missed some areas. So if you do this with the mask selected, it's just going to paint, and it's going to show you a reference of everything that you have. So that can be very, very useful if you're trying to get into certain areas. Well, I've come very close here, but I do have some light, so let's go ahead and disable that and zoom back in. And what I want to do is lightly paint out some of this. Now, let's just figure that 1, we don't want this pink light here, and 2, this shouldn't be as intense because it is a sunset. So I can actually go ahead and paint out some of this light that's accumulating on the water. I want to soften it out just a little bit, and we can do that just by painting this out. The other thing I'm going to do is get rid of a little bit of light around here. And you can see this artifacting, it's not really artifacting, but you see that light that we're getting there? I don't like it, so I'm going to get rid of it. Same thing as we're starting to move through the town. I do not like this restaurant's lighting. So what I can do is just paint it out and go back to the other scene as if it didn't exist at all. And we can paint some of the light in and out of the town. So we have control. This area right here, not really fond of that lighting back there. So what I can do is just lightly paint some of it out. Some of this here, that extra lighting that we're getting here, is because that lighten mode is actually putting that light over white objects. So we can go ahead and minimize some of that very easily just by going in and painting it out. So the lighten mode gives us a tremendous amount of power to bring this into our scene without any issues, without any special masking. And you can see this blue light here. Let's just go ahead and get rid of those. I don't know about that. Some of that's LED, and it just doesn't look right. This car trail, for example, we can get rid of. And then anything around here, if we feel like that's a little too intense, this light's a little too intense, we can just softly remove it. Softly remove it, just like that. Becomes pretty easy to just go in and paint things in and out. This light here that's hiding in this tree, let's get rid of that. If I turn it on and off, kind of see what's going on. On the tree, you guys see an issue right here. If I zoom in, that's the late blue hour, or the early blue hour, sorry, but you can see that I get a fuzzy tree. Let's go ahead and paint that out. I don't want that there at all. So let's go ahead and paint this out. Benefit of shooting sunset was a faster shutter speed, whereas towards the night it started to soften out and we ended up with some wind. So this looks pretty good. Final adjustments on this layer, just a little bit of removal in here, in this area down here on the beach. These boats, and I'll go ahead and zoom it out and save it in the background. So far, so good. Let's go back into Lightroom, and now we've adjusted to, let's adjust our late blue hour. Now, I've already shown this before. We have a extremely blown out church followed by a not so blown out church. So let's use this version right here. I'm going to do the same thing, pull the highlights down a little bit. You can see that that's just going to change the intensity of them. Probably need to go quite a bit. Same thing here. Let me just go ahead and crank the shadows up. Not ridiculously, but just enough so that I can get some of that ambient light back. Same thing, export with previous. Favorite hotkeys, select all, Command A, copy, Command C, close, Command W. Now that this layer is selected, Command V for paste, and we have adjusted late blue hour. Perfect. All right, now we have a 3-stage blend in the works. We have the 1 to 2 to 3, and you guessed it, let's change this to the light and blending mode. Let's see what's happening though. 1, some of that town's looking awesome. Like that just looks great. Tree, not so great. Way too intense, kind of ugly, that pink, revenge of the pink color here. So I already have a mask that I started to create. And if we take a look at it here, you can see that I've already started to zap out certain areas. But look at that. I actually missed a little area over here. Let's go ahead and clean that up. That's good. Let's go ahead and clean this up too. Sometimes it's good to swap back to these. But what I actually want to do is this. Now, instead of redoing all that masking or just selectively masking some little areas in, what I can actually do, I could copy this mask in, I could create a folder with a mask on it, but let's go ahead and start with something a little bit easier since this is the first lesson together. What I'm actually going to do is link this image to this image underneath, meaning it's going to share the mask. And if I do that, you can see now it's only going to exist inside of that area, which is pretty cool because I've already masked out the sky, I've masked out a lot of the beach and a lot of the trees themselves. Now, sharing this mask, I can create a new mask right on top, and we can go in and do the same thing. We can zap out some of the areas that we don't like. Select the brush tool. Immediately, not a fan of this stuff on the beach here, and I don't want to use the late light. I want the early light here, and I want the early light here. That's why I selected it. And I don't want all of this junk up here that's associated with that late blue hour. Same thing here. Some of this might be a little intense. Up here, this also might be a little intense. I don't want all that. Now, this is cool. Here, see those lights? I can decide whether I like the intense ones or I like the not so intense ones. And around this mountain, I really do like the intensity of that light. So let's just go ahead and remove some more over here. So we got to take a look at it, and you know what? It's looking pretty good, but it is a little intense. Let's move some of this down. Let's go ahead and paint some of this out just a little bit, and let's bring down the intensity of this building. I feel like that's too intense. This all looks pretty good. This one in here, I feel should be an earlier set, so we should definitely make this a little bit earlier. Basically, I'm looking for areas that are either too intense or too blown out. Up here, not so bad. Up here, let's go ahead and remove it. The cool thing is we can remove a lot of this and nobody would ever notice because it's just lighting. The geometry, the texture, and the buildings and everything underneath stays exactly the same. All we're doing is removing some of the lights, and in this case, some of the problem areas. And since we started with an early blue hour underneath, that means that underneath we're still going to have some light, albeit not quite as intense. But some of these lights are way too intense for my taste. So this is a very artistic process rather than a scientific one. In other words, we just have to go in and decide whether or not we want these lights to be on. In that case, I'm going to undo that because I actually like those lights. Here, maybe not so much. But then again, you know, let's just take them down in opacity just a little tiny bit so it's not as intense. Around the church here, let's go ahead and remove some of the light here. The beach is something to really address. I like the early part of it better. I didn't think it should be too intense. Even here, we should go ahead and remove some of that, make it less intense here on the beach, especially around this area. Let's double check that famous tree area. Is there anything happening here? A little bit, but I think it's just lighting. It looks okay, but we'll go ahead and clean it up.
just like that. Now, one last look just to see if there's anything we missed. Sometimes you have to turn it off and on a few times. And, you know, I'm on the fence about that. Let's just take the opacity down just a little bit. And you can see this is really easy just using the paintbrush tool. You can see what our masks look like here. A lot of little spots, spot removal, so to speak. Let's go ahead and take a look at how this is coming together. Now, so far, so good. Again, I'm just going to do a quick save in the background while we move on to the next step. Right now, I'm feeling like the blend is coming out fairly well, but I feel like my adjusted sunset layer doesn't have the right punch to it. So I need to sort of bring these into harmony. And to do that, I think I'm going to add a little bit more contrast and warmth to make it feel like it's a little bit later and to hopefully bring some of these values up. I feel like it's a little too flat and cold right now. So to do that, I'm going to duplicate it here. And instead of going back into Lightroom and doing it in the raw file, I'm going to access the same controls by going up to Filter and Camera Raw Filter. Now please bear in mind, using the Adobe Camera Raw filter, while we get all of the same controls and sometimes better looking controls than we do inside of Lightroom, we can't push these quite as far as the raw. Now saying that, these are PSDs or TIFF files at 16-bit ProPhoto. We can push them super far. But a lot of those things like those slight noise reductions, the sharpening, everything that I did in raw, we can push that a little bit further and get more out of it and more mileage before. But when we're just working in Photoshop, this is a great way to make small adjustments, especially to these settings. While I wouldn't do like a +4 exposure or -4 exposure, a few stops here and there and some color shifts are perfect using the Camera Raw filter. So first thing, let's go ahead and change the temperature. This is going to work similar to white balance. I'm just going to bring it up until it feels pretty nice and warm there. I think I might also want to pull the shadows up just a little bit more, a tiny little bit. And you know what? We can go ahead and add some vibrance as well. Now vibrance is interesting. If I take this too far, you can see that, well, it actually doesn't look hideous, but it looks pretty bad. But as I start to move this slowly up, it's bringing the detail and color back in these buildings and in the sky. So in this case, vibrance, a little bit goes a long way. And 42 is definitely a little bit too much, so let's roll that back to something like 20 or 21. Another thing here, if we go all the way to effects, we have the dehaze slider. Dehaze is really interesting. It's a little different than contrast, though it adds what we call deep contrast. And what it tries to do is create something that's called a depth map. So if you're not familiar with this, it basically analyzes what it considers to be in the foreground and what it considers to be the ultimate background. In this case would be the sky. Now, if you think about looking through a distant set of mountains, as they go further and further and further and further back, they change their colors to be more of the background. So you have dark mountains in the foreground and they get lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter the further back you're looking through atmospheric perspective. Now what this does is it figures out those shades, calculates that, and tries to add contrast to bring all that together. So while this doesn't have a lot of that detail, it does a little bit here, definitely does in the sky. So if I start to move the dehaze, you can see we're going to get a lot of rich contrast in the sky and in the water, which looks pretty good. So I just want to add sort of a global amount of that just to pump everything up a little bit more in the shadows and the highlights and the midtones. But where I really want to make some selective adjustments, I want to do that using the gradient. Gradient works the exact same way. If I click and drag, you can see I get the same thing. I'm going to try to select just the sky here, and I can move it. It's a little bit different than Lightroom. You get green to red here, which is a nice representation. Now, we also get the same settings that we used previously. So if you go up to this little fly-out window here, you can say Reset Local Correction Settings. Well, I warmed up the whole scene. I actually want to cool off the sky just a little bit. So let's compensate there just a little bit. I'm going to cool off the sky just like that. And I'm also going to add some more dehaze just to bump up the sky just a little bit, and I can go ahead and change my mask so that that's represented. Now let's go ahead and change this to 15. I feel like 15 is pretty good. That looks good. 15, dehaze. Let's go ahead and add a little bit more dehaze, something just like that. If I click over here, I get back to my global settings. I can see everything that I did here, the warmth And we're just going to leave that at 15. That was just to show that everything is applying. With that done, I'll go ahead and click OK. Well, the reason I duplicated the layer is because it will just apply it to anything you have selected. So here we're going to call this Adjusted Sunset Adding Warmth. Just like that. So you can see now, if I turn this on and off, our blend is starting to look better. And in the process, see all that blue? Well, I've actually been able to get rid of most of that blue as well. Plus, we end up with some really nice strong contrast in the sky itself. Let's go right to the top. I'm going to add a new layer, and we're going to call this Object Removal and Cleanup, if any. So now what we're going to do is we're going to zoom into this image and see if there's anything distracting that we want to get rid of. Any buoys, any boats, any people, any rocks in the foreground, any spots in the sky. Now's the time to do it. I'm going to start with the spot healing tool because it's perfect for removing small little things like this, small little things like this, tiny little things, any dust spots that you happen to have on your sensor, and I'm pretty sure that my X Pro 2 was very clean. This could be a bird or it could be Lee's DJI Mavic. You never actually know. But now's the time, before we marry all these things together, to find any of these little issues that we want to remove. Now, of course, we can do this later, but it's easier to do in the beginning, and it's just nice because then you don't end up with additional layers. Anything here on the beach, little spots you want to get rid of, let's say this boat down here, pretty easy to get rid of with the spot healing tool like this. Something to point out, this is winter, so we didn't have a lot of people on the beach. If it was summertime, you'd have beach chairs and people and all sorts of lights, and it would be a swarm of objects in the way. But right now it's actually pretty simple to not have to remove too much. Again, there's not going to be too much on the mountain here, maybe like that little white spot. Small things like that, anything that I find to be distracting. If there was a Walmart right here, I'd remove that. An IKEA, I'd remove that. But, you know, this is a small little Italian village, so there's not too much to get rid of. And it was pretty clean, but that layer just sits right on top. Now, when you are doing this, and we didn't have to use the clone stamp tool, but trust me, in this series, we will be using the clone stamp tool. But with any of these tools, I like to put it on a separate layer, just because I can toggle it on and off or delete it. And I've been using Content Aware, and sample all layers is very important. Sample all layers means that everything underneath will be sampled as well. If you're clicking around on this layer and nothing's happening, chances are that is not toggled, so just keep that in mind. Now with everything here, we're going to select it all, and I'm going to drag it to the folder icon, and I'm going to call this Blended Result. Go ahead and zoom out here. Now that everything is blended, what I want to do is kind of marry these layers together by adding an additional color correction. We're going to do that with the camera raw filters. The first thing I need to do is create a new layer. And what I'm going to do here is actually just, if I drag this down to the Make New Layer icon here, there's a few ways we're going to examine doing this in later chapters. Now I end up with a duplicate of this. If I use Command E on the keyboard, you can see that if I do this fly out, that merge group is Command E. So if I select that Command E, I can actually name this ACRF, or Adobe Camera Raw Filter. Go up here to Filter and once again select Camera Raw Filter. I feel like the highlights are a little too intense, so I'm going to pull those down, but I also feel like the exposure needs to be brought up. The whole thing needs to feel a little bit brighter. So I think something like 0.3 or 0.35 will probably do a lot of good to this image. The other thing is, when we start to adjust the exposure and the shadows, we definitely need to pull some contrast back in. Just a little bit sometimes can go a long way. This time I'm going to select the sky, but I'm going to do it a little differently. I need to adjust these highlights and some of these shadows here. I'm going to do that instead using a radial filter or an ellipse to select this. Works the same way, but when we drag, we actually create a different shape. Now what I'm actually going to do is rotate that so that it affects these areas of the sky that I feel need work. And the nice thing is, this shape is a little bit more forgiving than a gradient. For example, if I start adjusting the shadows and the highlights, I'm not really going to affect the mountain so much. But with this selected, remember, it binds to the previous settings, so let's go ahead and reset those local correction settings.
Now I feel like the highlights are a little too intense over here, so let's make some adjustments here. Let's pull those highlights down just a little, and you can see as I do that I get those details back. Let's also pull the whites down just a little bit to get those details back as well. The other thing I'm going to do is raise shadows up a little bit. If I go up a lot, you're going to see what's happening. Now, when I use dehaze, sometimes it adds too much contrast in the darks, and you can compensate by changing the shadows and the blacks just to sort of bring that back. So what I'm actually doing, pulling the highlights, pulling the whites down, and sort of balancing the entire sky itself. With selective adjustments, we actually have dehaze built in, so you can bring a little bit of that back if you really wanted to, just to get the richness and color. We can go ahead and stretch this out just to make sure we have the entire sky selected. Now, that's looking pretty good, but let's do one more thing. Highlights are adjusted here, but I feel like I want more intensity here in the water. So we can do a similar thing with another radial gradient, just like this. We can bring it in something just like that. So that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and reset those local correction settings. Go ahead and pull the highlights up. So more intensity here. Let's go ahead and pull the shadows up just a little bit. And if I add a little bit of contrast and a little bit of dehaze just to pull it all together. We could experiment with a little bit of temperature just to bring a little of that warmth back. That actually looks pretty good, maybe a tiny little bit of about 5. So if we go back to our settings here, I think that's going to do it for this adjustment. Let's click OK. With this camera raw filter applied, we've done some additional adjustments to the highlights, the shadows, the tonality of this image to make it look a little bit more true. The other thing that we've done is we've married all of this together. It creates a harmony. Once we put these layers together, create this multi-stage blend, once you get it close, by color correcting everything together, you can kind of push it back together or marry it all together. Sometimes you have to do adjustments inside of the layers themselves here, which we already did. We warmed up an additional layer. Sometimes it all works pretty well or perfectly from Lightroom, and we can go right into the final color correction result. But now the heavy lifting has been done. Now it's time for the micromanagement, or the small control with adjustment layers. Now, I like to use adjustment layers. They can be created here, down at this create adjustment layer area, and the nice thing is if I create a curves, for example, it puts it on a layer above everything. So if I tweak this like this, I could say, you know what, I don't like it. Turn it off, turn it on, reset it, or just delete it and try it again. As an example, if I selected this, went up to image, I could also say adjustments, curves, Command M on the keyboard. And if I did this and pressed OK, it doesn't give me a layer on top. It doesn't give me anything. It just applies the result, in which case if I don't like it, I have to undo it. So adjustment layers end up being a nonlinear way to work on different things. So for example, let's say we have this curves. Let's just call this shadow boost. Let's just say I wanted to boost the shadows a little bit. Well, this is our entire histogram. You can see our histogram here, mirrors it right on the curve. So if I do this, I'd be tweaking the highlights or clamping the highlights. Here, I'd be crushing the shadows or clamping the shadows. Here, I'd be doing a gamma boost on the midtones themselves, leaving the highlights and shadows in place and distributing my correction along this curve, which basically means along the histogram itself. So that means that I could just add a point here and then use the arrow keys to just boost it a little bit in the shadows. What I could do is just come back down here so that this is just a shadow adjustment, a slight shadow adjustment, just like that. And I might add quite a few of these layers. But right now, I want to tackle some of the color issues in this scene. And let's first talk about the greens. This is going to be a really easy one. Let me just go ahead and zoom in a little bit here on this image. Here we go, just like that. Now, I want to manipulate these greens. I want to pop them a little bit more from the background, meaning that I just want to add green color to them. Now, a very easy way to do that, and one of my favorite ways, is to go here to a photo filter. And I can actually change it from warming to cooling, which we're going to be using a lot throughout this tutorial, but in this case, I'm going to select green. If I tweak the greens a lot, you can see that my image looks like crap. But if I look at the greens down here, it's actually making a more of a pure green color. So let's just go ahead and pull that back down just a little bit, somewhere around 30, and I'm going to black out this mask. Now when I say black out a mask, I'm basically going to select
the mask. If it's white, one quick way to do this is to use Command-I or invert, and it'll invert it to black. That allows me to go in and then use the paintbrush tool, swapping my palette. You guys remember that's going to be X on the keyboard. And now with a little flow, like 10%, 20%, I can actually paint in some green color. So if I do this, I can actually bring back some of the green vibrance in this area here and separate those greens from the background. So here, especially this tree, I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I want it to be a little bit more green. You can see I toggle that on and off, and it actually creates the greens. We're going to call this green adjustment. Now here in the mountain as well, if I zoom in like here, if I use a very, very light amount on the paintbrush, we'll select that mask, change the size, change it so it's super soft brush, low flow, I can actually go ahead and paint again some of that green in here where it should be. A lot of this over here should be green. We'll adjust that in a moment. But right here, let's go ahead and add a little bit more green back here. That moss area, some of this terracing that they have here, we can just go ahead and custom change the distribution of the color here that got a little washed out. That looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and add another layer. Now what I really want to address here, see the mountain here? This mountain, if you're standing there, especially during the day, right now we have backlighting. And that backlighting is causing it to be washed out, sort of flat and gray. So I can assure you that all these trees, they are very vibrant and green, and these parts of the mountain, they look warm. They are not supposed to look cold and flat. So what we're going to have to do is encourage the natural colors to come out just a little bit more, and I'm going to do that with another photo filter. This time, a warming filter. You can audition each one of these and see which ones you like the best. For this example, I'm going to use the 81, and I'm going to turn it up just a little bit until I like what it's doing to this mountain. See, it's bringing those colors back. And we're going to go ahead and invert this mask again, like I did last time. And now, here, very carefully, I'm going to go ahead and paint that in with the brush. So we're going to go right here, starting here, and we're just going to go ahead and paint that warmth back into the mountain, just like this. Now, I'm going to start with the easy parts. The easy parts are areas that don't border any colors I don't want to change. But for the sky, I'm going to have to be a little bit more careful. So what I'm going to do is just kind of lightly brush this in around the edges here. So we're going to start globally, large brush here, right around this area, and then I'm going to make it a little bit smaller, and I'm going to get in here on these little details. The nice thing about using the brush, we could go with a lasso tool and make a selection of the sky, but we have plenty more lessons to get into complicated and specific types of masking. So right now, as long as this is close and we don't go too far into the sky, it should look perfect. Hitting the backslash key, we'll be able to see the areas that we've missed. In this case, I don't want to miss any of this. I want more of that, just like that. And the reason I'm using a low flow is because I really want this to blend in with itself. Just like that. That looks pretty good. So we're going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit more. B for brush. We're going to go ahead and select the mask again. And now I have this bound to these hotkeys here. The hotkeys again are Control, Option on a Mac, and click. But if you don't have that, you can use the bracket keys to go up and down in size on the keyboard as well. Sometimes I'll use the bound key on the stylus, and sometimes I'll actually just use those bracket keys. Once this is all selected and you feel good about the mask itself, and you can see I need a little bit more here and a little bit more here. Overall, that's looking pretty good. We can even add a little bit here to the trees. So if I wanted to warm these trees up, offset their color a little bit, make them a little bit more vivid, we could do that as well. Once this is all selected, the nice thing is you can go back into the properties of the mask by double-clicking, and you can change the density, and you can bring it up even more until it looks exactly right. The other thing is here, we have that green adjustment. We could bring some green back in as well, right over top here, just to offset some of that color. You'd have to be extremely subtle with this, just a little tiny bit right on the top, just to offset some of that color and separate it just a little bit. Let's take a look here. That looks pretty good. We could actually go in and do a better job around these edges here, just a little bit here and here. Not too much, just a hair. There, more of the warmth. Bring in the warmth. And man, that's reminded me, saying warmth, how cold it was in Positano. It was really surprising to be here outside of the summer months That looks pretty good. Might want to remove a little bit right here. Easy, just paint in and paint out. Now, the next thing I want to do is remove an issue here that I see with some of the lighting. And that specifically is the pink cast on some of this lighting on these white buildings. In order to do that, I'm going to use a hue and saturation adjustment layer. Hue and saturation is pretty cool. Now, when you first learn Photoshop, you kind of do this and you think, why would anybody ever do that? Well, that's because we're doing this globally. We don't want to do that globally. Similar fashion, if you change the lightness, that looks really bad. You never want to do that. Saturation is kind of a no-brainer. In a similar fashion, this should be pretty obvious. If we change the saturation, it's going to be global, and we don't want to do that. So let's go ahead and zero that out. Where this becomes more powerful, and we're going to be using this often, is changing the individual colors in the individual selective areas. So in this case, I want to change the magentas. Now that's more of a magenta, and you can see that it falls somewhere between red and blue. And with that selected, I can make changes to how this works exactly. If I change the lightness now, you can see that I'm just going to adjust that area. If you really want to see what it's doing, if you turn the saturation up all the way, you can see a hard line selection of what you're actually manipulating, and you can make adjustments to that accordingly. Now, once you do that, I definitely encourage zeroing that out. And now we're going to have to decide what we want to do. With the lightness now, if I roll it up, it's going to brighten up those areas that were red and magenta. If I turn it down like this, it's going to darken them up. In this case, I want to lighten them up. I just want to remove some of that pink and pull the saturation down just a little bit. Now, we're going to call this magenta reduction, and this photo filter will become aggressive warming. Let's go ahead and Command I and invert that. With the brush selected, same thing here. I'm just going to go ahead and remove by painting white. And I'm just going to remove some of this distracting lighting. Some of the lighting that I think isn't exactly clean light. And some of it over here I might want to pull down just a little bit. Just a little bit, especially in these areas. This is a building that has magenta on it, so I'd leave that alone and just focus on the lighting around it here and here. Just cleaning up little things. We're going to be doing a lot of small adjustments to color for color separation and color cleaning. Now that is actually a magenta towel. I'd leave that alone as well. Some of the light down here we can remove in the white. Some of the magenta light around here. Same thing down here. We can clean up the beach a little bit. See this light? Easy to just remove it and leave the yellow intact. Really, really simple. Same thing here. We may actually want to clean that light up, clean some of this light up. And that looks pretty good. Adjustment layers are really powerful, and often we can get away with some massive corrections just using painted masks. Well, let's say we want to do something different. Let's say we wanted to isolate this area of the sky, particularly the highlights. What if we wanted to warm these highlights down? What if we wanted to cool down the sky, shift and bring it into more of a purple blue, something more post-sunset? Well, in that case, we could paint some things in, but let's experiment with something a little bit more advanced. And channel masking is what I want to cover now, and we're going to do this extensively throughout Photographing the World, so right now I just want a quick introduction to how exactly this works. Now our RGB is here, so if we click, we see the image. But I can select red, green, and blue and see a white and black distribution of the amount of pixels in that color range that exists in this image. In other words, if I see that part of the image is white, that means blue exists in this image. Black means there is no blues. So black is 0% and white is 100%. So each one of these channels is going to be uniquely different. Now, remember, with RGB, if you add red, green, and blue together, you get white light. But there's definitely more red in the sky than there is in this area. So this cloud is blue, this cloud is red. So if I change it to here, you can see that it's a little bit more flat, more of an even distribution. So I can find the area of heaviest contrast in the sky is probably the red. Now each one of these channels can be manipulated. If I manipulate this channel, it's going to manipulate the color of the red in the entire image. I don't want to do that. Instead, I want to create a custom selection. And any of these can be loaded as a selection or duplicated.
So the first thing I can do is just grab one of these and duplicate it. So now with red copy, I can name this anything I want. And I can paint on it like this. I can do anything I want to it, and it's going to be fine because it's not going to affect the RGB. If I did that to one of these channels, obviously it would. So this creates a copy of a channel, a mask that I can edit and then use as a selection or a mask later. So keeping that in mind, I can either duplicate one of these or I can load them as a selection. Each one of these can be loaded as a selection by holding the Command key and clicking. So here's a selection for the blue, green, and red. If I selected the red and created a new mask, you can see I get a mask for the red. If I selected the blue, created a new mask, you can see I get a mask for the blue. Pretty easy stuff. Let's go ahead and delete these because what we're going to do is just go ahead and grab the red channel like this, Command click. We're going to go to the layers, and what we're going to do is create a new folder and apply that mask to that folder. We're going to call this Reds. Now, inside of this folder, I'm going to create a new curves layer. Now, this curves layer is going to be controlled by this folder and this mask. So as I start to make adjustments to this, the options here, let's just say I want to increase the red. Let's say I want to increase the red on this side of the sky. I can actually do that just by tweaking it a little bit here, or even the gamma just a little bit. And let's say I want to go into the blue and do the same thing. The blue, I can also do the same thing just by tweaking it. And going back and forth, I can start to create this cool red-blue effect, sort of a pink sunset back here. And if I toggle that on and off, you can see what's happening. Now that looks really good, but obviously I don't want that to occur in this part of the image. Now bear in mind, if I hold Option and click this Reds mask, it's affecting everything that's white and not affecting anything that's black. Well, since this folder becomes a controller for this image, now with the curves, I can create a new mask on those curves. And let's say I only want that to happen from about here. So with the gradient tool selected from white to black, I basically start here. Just like anything in Photoshop that has a draw line, if you hold Shift, it'll lock it to 45-degree angles. And I can have that go from here to here. And you can see that now this is only going to affect that part of the sky. Well, that looks pretty good, but if I shift-click this to disable it, you can see that I probably want this part of the sky to be pink as well. So, since this controls everything, this controls just the curves, let's go ahead and paint some of that back, just like this. So I'm just going to paint some of that pink right back into the sky. Just like that. So really quickly, we can change and transform the look of the sunset fairly dramatically. And we can custom paint the area that we want it to exist, and we can use a channel selection here. This was a channel selection just to isolate the red. So we're going to call this, what am I going to call this? Sky Adjustment. So all of these color corrections, these adjustment layers, they're very powerful. So if you just wanted to add a little bit more brightness and contrast here, we could add 10% more contrast very easily. If you wanted to add some overall vibrance, we could add vibrance here just like this, adding maybe 25% more vibrance to the whole image. And you can see that that's really going to start to pop out those details of the sky. So these are easy to just stack up, and you can see that they're named for what they are. And we can just call this slight contrast, and we can just call this slight vibrance. Now the combinations are infinite and there are a lot of different options. We're going to experiment with so many different adjustment layers and masking techniques. But right now what I want to cover is sharpening and noise reduction. First, sharpening. And to do that, I'm going to use Command J to duplicate this layer, and I'm going to name it High Pass Filter. And the reason I did is, you guessed it, I'm going to go up to Filter, Other, High Pass. Now, these Fujifilm files are 24 megapixels. I really find that somewhere between 24 and 36 works well with 2.5 to 3 and a radius of 4, sometimes up to 50 megapixel. But I'm going to use 2.5 for this demonstration. Now right now it looks pretty bad. It creates a gray layer, and as I zoom in here, it actually finds these edges and creates sort of an embossed edge around them. You can actually see that here on the mountain. Inside of the mountain,
dark gray. Outside light gray, everything else solid gray. If we change this to a blending mode like overlay, for example, it removes 50% gray and leaves everything else there intact. So when I do this, you can see if I turn it off and then turn it back on, you can see how that sharpening is really, really intense. If you go down to something called soft light takes the intensity down just a little bit. With that in mind, you can also change the opacity of this layer and determine a custom intensity for this high pass. You might also want to change the name to say 2.5 so we know that that's what we use. Same thing that we've been doing. We are going to add a mask to this, mask out the areas that we don't want. Now right now, if I create a mask, it'll create a white mask. Let me undo. If I hold Option, click the mask, it'll create a black mask, which is exactly what I want. With that in mind, I'm going to bring out the brush with about a 50% flow, and we're just going to go ahead and custom paint the city in. So I just want the city to be sharp. If I show my Rubylith settings here, you can see that area definitely there, some of the beach and the meat of this town, and maybe a little bit of the mountain, just a tiny little bit of the mountain, just like that. So that's going to be the main bulk of the sharpening. Next, let's do some noise reduction. Let's go ahead and duplicate this again. Reason being, I'm going to go up to filter again and once again into the camera raw filter. Let's go ahead and zoom into the sky. Now, I haven't done too much to this, just a little bit of dehaze, some contrast. I haven't used any clarity or anything like that, and it's still really dramatic. But you can see there's a little bit of noise. Now, something to point out here. If you're posting this to Facebook or Instagram or social media in general, you probably don't have to worry about this too much because at 1600 pixels or 2048, it's not really going to be noticeable. But if you're going to print this, if you're going to hang this on your wall or you're going to send this to a client as a final piece of artwork, then chances are they're going to want you to apply some light noise reduction. We're going to do that selectively, and we're also going to do that using this setting right here. So you see the noise reduction works and operates the same way it does inside a Lightroom. And as you start to change the luminance, you can see that this noise will disappear. Now, obviously, changing this all the way to 100 is even going to soften the clouds. We don't want that. We want to find a tolerance, basically, of how much we need to remove the noise without going overboard. So let's say we pick 40. Well, what would happen if I zoomed out and now zoomed into the town? Well, what does 40 look like on the town? Well, let's take a look. You can see that it's removing a lot of the detail. So as I select 40, I have to be careful because now if I overlap the town, it's going to make it a little soft. Now something that you can do is retain luminance detail. You can turn this all the way up to 100, and this will try to figure out what is noise and what is detail. But if I go back over to the sky, which I'm most concerned about right now, if I start to place the luminance detail higher than 50, it will bring back a little bit of noise. So somewhere around 40, 35 to 50 seems to work really well if it needs to be aggressive. Luminance detail, I usually try to keep it right around 60 to 85 depending on the scene itself. So let's go with this. We'll make it a little bit more intense at 45, 75. And I'll apply the result. We're going to name this noise reduction. And same thing, I'm going to black out a mask, and we're going to do this the easy way for now, since this is lesson 1, and what I actually want to do is paint in the area that I want it to affect. I'm going to do that using the backslash key so that we can see exactly where I'm painting in. So right now, I'm using a solid paintbrush at 100%. I want all of this to be soft, no matter what. Once I decide the areas that are going to be soft, completely soft, next thing I'll do is switch to a lighter brush, like 10%, and I'll brush in just a little bit here so we have a blend from the sky to the mountain. Now remember, this wasn't severely noisy, but let's go ahead and remove some of the noise from the water too. Just so it's nice final image, just like that. A little bit of noise reduction goes a long way. So now we have selective noise reduction. Remember the edge of the mountain didn't have a lot of detail anyway, so we're not losing any. Certainly don't want any noise reduction in the town. We've already handled that, transferring these files from Lightroom into Photoshop. We'll go ahead and turn that off. Zoom way in, even almost to the pixel level. You can see what will happen there.
Zoom it out just a little bit more, and you can see our noise reduction layer before and after. That looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and back this up a little bit here, just like that. I'll zoom it up a little bit. Let's go back into Lightroom. What I actually want to do is take our original exposure, which was this one, and what I'm going to do is reset it, and I'm going to export it. And I'm going to export it with previous. And we'll just go ahead and use unique names. Basically means it already exists, so it's going to name it something else. -1 in this case. Select all, we'll copy this. And we'll bring it into, and you can see how many layers we ended up here. All the way in to the bottom of this. Let's go ahead and put it on the bottom. I'm going to name this Original Raw. Perfect. So let's just go ahead and take a look at everything that we've done here. Now, we started with the original raw, and then we did some adjustments here with the blue hour and adjusted for the sunset. If you remember, we just warmed things up a little bit. From there, we did some camera raw filter, noise reduction on top of that, and some color corrections just to sort of tweak it a little bit. So now, here's time for the big reveal. Straight out of camera, single raw, here is our original image. Now, looks good, has potential, beautiful scene, but we quickly went from original exposure from here to here. Now that is a huge change from the straight out of camera raw file. Well, that wraps things up for lesson 1 of Photographing the World 3. I can't wait to dive deeper into the complexities of post-processing in some of the most beautiful parts of the world. So the next time you see me, we'll be back in the field, and we're still going to be in Pasitano searching for the perfect blue hour shot.